So good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in today. I'm Jonathan Brinston. I'm a partner here at BDB Pitmans, and I would welcome you to this morning's discussion. In the next hour, we are going to be exploring the subject of impact investment generally, and in particular, how investors can better engage with it, why they should be interested in it, and also as we exit lockdown, what role it can play to help provide some of the solutions to the social and environmental challenges that we face and which have been amplified by COVID-19. So there is quite a lot of ground to cover in the next hour. And we also help to include some Q&A as well. So please make use of that function on Zoom. But I'm sure we'll be able to get through this all with the help of our four excellent and hugely knowledgeable panelists. So I will kick things off with introductions, and I would ask our panelists to turn on their video as I introduce them. We have Sarah Gordon. Hi, Sarah. Sarah is the Chief Executive Officer at the Impact Investing Institute. Sarah also sits on the Board of Social Finance, and prior to that, she was business editor at the FT. We have David Rosso. I'm sure David is there. Whilst David's clicking the button, I'll explain it. David is a strategic investor at the Gates Foundation. I think David has been part of the Gates Strategic Investment Fund since the beginning, and in that role has been involved in a wide range of investments across a range of sectors and geographies, and I suspect has probably encountered every possible permutation of a social investment. We have Paul Blythe. Hi, Paul. Paul is a battle-hardened ESG and impact investor, as well as running his own consultancy. Paul is the co-founder of impact investment house Snowball, chair of the Financial Inclusion Forum, board member of the Church Investors Group, and a member of the investment committee at the Friends Provident Foundation. And last but by no means least, we have Simon Chisholm. Hi, Simon. Simon is the Chief Investment Officer of Resonance. For those of you who might not know, Resonance is a specialist social impact investment company who help charities and social enterprises access social finance, as well as creating and managing social impact funds to help address a wide range of social issues. So thank you to our panelists for joining. And if this was live, you'd be greeted now with a warm round of applause from the audience. So you'll have to just take that as read, I'm sure. So to start, and to kick things off, and because not everyone who is watching this, I imagine, will be well acquainted with this area. Sarah, can I ask you perhaps the single most important question and that's to explain what impact investment actually means?
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. Nice to be here. So impact investment in our definition is investment that's made with the intention to deliver positive, measurable social and environmental benefit alongside a financial return. And every sort of element in that sentence is important. So the intentionality, you're doing the investment to generate a financial return, but also to deliver the positive impact. But you're also committing to that impact being measurable and accountable. So I spoke to, when I very first started this job at the Impact Investing Institute, we launched officially only in November 2019, although of course that feels like a century ago at the moment. But I spoke, one of the first events I had was speaking to someone in one of the large FTSE 100 pension schemes who said, oh, but we invest in student housing, so we're already an impact investor. Well, you're not if you don't know what impact you're actually trying to deliver and making an effort to measure and hold yourself accountable for that impact. And I don't know if it's at all helpful, Jonathan, now to share that slide, which helps people understand where impact investment sits in relation to
Sure.
ESG. Right, so I shall quickly, will emphasize to everyone who's listening that this is the only slide. So we find this quite helpful in explaining where impact investment sits on the spectrum of capital. So you've got traditional investment where you just accept competitive risk-adjusted financial returns. And then you've got responsible and sustainable investment. And in those spaces, you are applying an ESG, an environmental, social and governance lens to the investments that you're making. And obviously, frankly, this is becoming pretty mainstream now. I mean, rare is the investor who is not at least thinking about ESG as a risk mitigation lens rather than a way to deliver positive impact. And so where impact investment sits is squarely in the middle of this spectrum, where you're intending not just to avoid harm and mitigate ESG risks, and not just to benefit stakeholders, but you're also aiming to contribute to solutions. And obviously some of those things are things that philanthropy does as well, or aims to do, but of course philanthropy does not seek to deliver a financial return. And I mean, one of the biggest, I shall stop sharing then, one of the biggest misunderstandings that we seek to clarify to help people get over at the Impact Investing Institute is this idea that delivering positive impact necessarily means sacrificing financial return. There are decisions to be made often about the degree of impact and the degree of financial return that you're aiming for, and different models. But we are building an evidence base at the Institute to demonstrate that across a range of asset classes, sectors and geographies, you can deliver positive impact alongside a market competitive financial return.
That's brilliant, Sarah. I think that's wonderfully comprehensive and clear. David, could I just ask you briefly, from the Gates Foundation perspective, is that how you see impact investment? Do you see that, or would you see it more as a philanthropic tool, or somewhere in between? Oh,
can you hear me now?
yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. That's a fantastic definition, and you know what I think that the industry has coalesced around. As a practitioner, I have a slightly different perspective on it. That it is trying to achieve objectives apart from a financial return, and so sometimes there can be a financial return commensurate with those objectives. But it's kind of like trying to ride two horses. You may be able to do it for a little while, but at some point you have to make a choice. And I think in our experience, we certainly have investments that have had a lot of alignment between those objectives, but at some point, some investments do diverge. And at that point, you, I think, need to make a choice of which camp you're in. And that kind of decision is really, I think, what we've seen as differentiating impact investment versus ESG, and also recognizing that we are a little bit more towards the philanthropic charitable objective side as a program-related investor, which is a defined term in the U.S. and UK tax codes that I won't bore folks with, but we do have a stated and required objective to advance the foundation's strategic objectives within philanthropy through our investments. And so that's why we define ourselves as the strategic investment fund, and think of ourselves as in some ways more aligned to a corporate venture organization. So Intel Capital or GV with Alphabet, or one of these organizations that's making investments specifically to advance the foundation's objectives, and doing that regardless of the financial return.
That's very helpful. I mean, Paul, you do a lot of work with charities who are thinking about this area, and that's a subject we'll come back to as we go through. But do you think the jargon is in any way holding organizations back in terms of this slight confusion about where ESG and responsible investment ends and impact investment begins?
Yes.
Good. So Simon, if you want to elaborate, that's fine.
I think it depends on who you're talking to and what the circumstances are and so on. I mean, I'm drafting a impact investment guide for Church Investment Group, and it's really hard to define these things and explain them. And ESG is not well understood at all. It's incredibly confusing. What the perception of what it is as opposed to what it really is. And then the definition within it is changing, and then providers mean different things by it. So yeah, it's a whole alphabet soup which confuses people. I think what's most helpful to people, and if you're sitting, I try to put myself in the shoes of someone sitting on the investment committee of a charity or a pension fund or a family office or an individual, is sort of go back to that almost theory of change thing. So what do you actually want to do with your capital, right? What are your objectives? And there could be many, and they differ person by person, organization by organization. Let's talk about that, and really and help them understand. Okay, what are we trying? Now, how do you deliver those objectives? And you can do that through impact investment. You can do that through ESG strategies. You can do that through philanthropy. You can do that through financial return, but be aware of what the consequences of just going for money mean. And it's that kind of journey. So I tend to move people away from trying to define one thing or another. And even within context, I mean, I contradict myself, right? So if you ask me about creating good jobs in the United Kingdom, that's a completely different conversation to Sierra Leone or Malawi for me, right? So if it's good jobs in the UK, right, we're talking ILO standards, we're talking about living hours, we're talking about living wage, we're talking about training, we're talking about less developed areas and communities. It's a really complex situation. Whereas if you go to Malawi or Sierra Leone, you offer me 10 awesome jobs, or 1,000 jobs, or 10,000 jobs of any kind that aren't delivered by a family or a government, I'm definitely putting my energy towards the latter, whilst working with them to make sure those jobs are great, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to sort of not do an investment in Malawi because I'm worried about an ILO standard, if you know what I mean. So it's context-based, it's individual-based, very confusing. So I tend to move people towards what's your objective, and go from there.
Thank you, Paul. Simon, just picking it up from your perspective, because there is a certain lack of clarity, or maybe not for the people on this, who, you know, for the panelists, but there's a certain lack of clarity in the wider world regarding some of the terms associated with impact investment. And because by comparison, success or failure with conventional financial investments is very easy to determine. Did we make money? Did we lose money? How do you move investors across the aisle who might be somewhat skeptical about what impact means, the potential for impact washing, and that this is all just some, you know, glorified marketing wheeze?
Yeah, I think you have to decompose that question probably into a couple of factors there. I mean, the first is, do you in all cases need to trade off returns for impact? And I think whilst we completely agree with David's perspective that there are cases where that's a valid thing to do and the right thing to do, and what, to Paul's point, what the investor wants to do, there are actually also, there is a wide segment of the impact investment market that does not need to trade off return for impact. So it's perfectly appropriate for a pension fund who is seeking a risk-adjusted return to be looking to do that with impact in some areas of the impact investment market. And actually, we would argue that there are some long-term benefits to impact investment approaches to delivering more sustainable returns and bringing diversification to portfolios. So I think, and for us, that's through property funds that focus on impact areas around homelessness, vulnerable women, learning disability, but are actually fundamentally delivering property-style returns to investors. We would argue on a more sustainable basis. So I think, you know, that's part of the argument about why people can move across the aisle, as you put it. But the second part of your question, I think, is equally valid, is, you know, is there a big potential at the moment for this term impact washing, you know, everything suddenly becoming impact? And I think the answer to that is yes, there is some risk of that. I think there is an ongoing pressure towards higher reporting standards and people being clear about what they mean when they're measuring and reporting impact. I would simply say at the moment, maybe let's not hold out for the perfect standard, but let's just look at what impact managers are actually reporting and ask two fairly simple questions as an investor. You know, is that impact measurement really deeply connected to the impact that the investment is trying to create? Or is it by contrast, rather superficial? And is it actually being used as information to manage and improve the impact of that investment strategy over time? Or is it, by contrast, more of a window dressing and a reporting exercise? We think that's what at the moment would differentiate an impact fund from an impact washing exercise.
Okay, can I just add a little quip there? So the other thing you might do is, if you get into it, dig into the prospectus, really dig in and look for the alignment between what this is trying to achieve from an impact perspective and the various incentives and the various structures for that management team. And actually, I read through the entire prospectus of Simon's organization, and buried, this was years ago, buried in the detail was the absolute alignment with management, with financial and impact outcomes. And so you're like, okay, these guys are really they're very clear where they're headed. And this was years ahead of anybody. So those are the sorts of things you can look for.
Thank you both. I mean, David, just coming back to you, because some of the sort of coming out of this conversation, do you think impact is something which is sort of in the eye of the beholder, and should the focus really be, and I think as Paul and Sarah have been talking about, the focus really should be on how you define the solution of what the investment is set up to achieve, whether it be SDG or otherwise, rather than always talking about impact?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think one of the things that we've found really striking over the last decade, trying to make investments that are impactful, but also coordinate with other like-minded charitable organizations, is that capitalism is a tool that coordinates and aligns incredibly efficiently, and that's, I think, one of its core competencies. But often philanthropic organizations look for the gaps in capitalism or existing structures of society to try to help specific individuals. So the but-for test, if you will. So the theory of change around population A, who may be overlooked by that. And so when you try to coordinate across a bunch of like-minded philanthropic institutions, it turns out they're actually not as like-minded as you think they would be, because they all have their little niche of individuals, pet projects, areas where they're really focused on, which is fantastic. And that's a great role for philanthropy, but it makes it really hard to kind of align those objectives of broad, what should be like-minded institutions with capitalistic tools. And so I think the approach we take has some, maybe I can go higher. I think to be a good impact investor, there's good news and there's bad news. And the good news is that in order to do that, it's the same tools as being a good investor. Invest in what you know and invest with who you trust. It's not anything new. It's not a new paradigm. The problem is, and the bad news is, that it's really hard to be a good investor. Getting outsized financial returns in the long term, outperforming the market is incredibly difficult. And I think being a very good impact investor is equally difficult. And you have to go on that path assuming that you're going to have to do the work. You're going to have to read the prospectus. You may have to sacrifice some of your specific objectives you're trying to achieve in order to coordinate with broader pools of capital that might be like-minded, but might have the same narrow thesis or theory of change that you have. And just understanding, where on that return spectrum you want to be, and what, which horse you're riding at the end of the day, I think is step one to really making this tool useful to advance your objectives.
That's great, thank you. So just finally on this segment of the discussion, part of what the Institute does is promote policy ideas. Do you think the government could play a more meaningful role in promoting impact investing in terms of policy initiatives or regulation? What's the Institute gunning for?
Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, to paraphrase Paul. The government, the first thing I think to say is that there is an enormous need to mobilise private sector capital at much greater scale to address the social and environmental challenges that we face. So that's, it's the climate emergency, but it's also, and I think this has been massively highlighted by the pandemic, it's things like access to decent healthcare, housing, jobs, There are really severe inequities in across the globe, I mean in this country and across the globe, that have really worsened the impact of a pandemic such as the one we're in the grips of at the moment. So I think it's really brought us sort of face and centre to the fact that we need more capital to address these issues. And this is also coming at a time when, as we know, partly because of the pandemic, the public purse has never been emptier. So I think a recognition at the centre of all governments that tools which mobilise private sector capital more effectively for public good are really useful for them is the first, the most important sort of recognition. But then I think there are a couple of other areas where, certainly at the Institute, we really have been encouraging not just the UK government, but others to take action because of the positive signalling effect, apart from anything else, that they can have on the market. So one example is the Green Plus sovereign bond, the Green Plus gilt proposal that we, with the Green Finance Institute and the LSE, proposed to the UK government last autumn, which is the idea that you deliver positive environmental outcomes and well-defined social co-benefits. So, for example, around skills and jobs in parts of the country that need them most. And obviously delighted that the government announced a green gilt programme in the autumn, and they've also shown a real openness to hearing the views of our community and others in the form of a stakeholder discussion forum that we're a member of. So, but why is it important for the government to issue green gilts? It's not just important for lots of large institutional investors who are facing lots of demands from their clients for and asset owners for more sustainable investments at scale. It also provides a really important signal, not just to other countries, but also to the rest of the market. And we know that in countries which have issued green sovereign bonds, so France, Ireland, Belgium, it's had a really very positive stimulating effect on the rest of the market. So you get more corporates and more local authorities then issuing green or sustainable fixed income instruments. So that's one area. And the second area is around, I mean, we've touched on it in the earlier discussion, but is around reporting. And we really profoundly believe that we need to move to a world where all businesses have to account not just for their positive, but their negative impacts, not just on their own performance, but on their impacts on the wider society and on the environment. Why is that important? Because that is the way that we will have genuinely sustainable profit streams and therefore genuinely sustainable economies in the future. And also because at the moment, we, society, the taxpayer, the public, is paying the cost for the negative externalities that businesses are causing and not being either held accountable for or actually having to pay for financially. So there are some really exciting developments. Just very quickly, internationally, the IFRS Foundation, which oversees financial reporting standards, is setting up a working group to think about international sustainability standards. It's a great first step. We think in the end, sustainability and financial performance standards need to be integrated. And the second thing is in the UK, the Financial Reporting Council recently consulted on the need for what it's public interest reporting, which would be essentially impact reporting, negative and positive impact reporting. It's not a time to be laying more burdens on business, but it's a time to be helping and enabling business that want to report on this in a more standardized, transparent way. It's time for the government to help them do that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think transitioning towards greater transparency is probably the solution to some of the concerns we raised previously about what impact means. But you touched on the pandemic, and so just to focus on that, as you said, it's exacerbated inequalities in our society, not only in the UK but across the world. And I suppose this is more something of a philosophical question for David. Do you think the principles and values underpinning impact investment are even more important now than they were prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's kind of two lessons for me from the pandemic. the first is just about the structural inequalities and challenges in the system. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is not racist, but it's disproportionately affected people of color. It's not elitist, but it's disproportionately affected both economically and from a health perspective low-income communities. And the reason for this is because it just naturally, through evolution and other structures, finds the weakest, most overlooked segments of society. And so it is yet another lesson in that we need to be intentional about supporting and overcoming those structural issues in order to achieve the objectives that I hope everyone on this call has. The second lesson is that all of those challenges make investments higher risk and harder. And so that's one of the key premises for why I think there is often a trade-off between impact and investing, because reaching those communities is more expensive. Those people have less income to buy services and goods. The risks and challenges and capital available for investments that are specifically targeting trying to get past these structural inequalities have higher bars of success and are more challenging. And so it's, I think, difficult and potentially impossible to try to address the structural challenges, many of which are perpetuated by capitalism, with capitalistic tools, unless we use those tools as an end rather than a means.
Oh, what a great answer. I mean, Paul, you've been here in ESG and impact since the very beginning. Do you think, given the implications of the pandemic for the reasons David's outlined, that this must be the turning point for the much heralded impact revolution that everyone's been talking about perhaps for the last 20 years?
Well, I'm not sure I've been there from the beginning. I'm not quite that old. I think the first example in the modern era was 1972, when the Anglicans objected to GM operating in South Africa. But but fair enough. I don't think I can add too much to the erudite words of David, other than perhaps highlight an example. And then, if I may, I'd like to say a couple of comments about what government can do as well. Your previous question. I think in financial inclusion and microfinance, which is something I've been doing for quite some time, I think the pandemic has just really highlighted the issues and presented a real challenge to the people that invest in financial inclusion, many of whom are commercial investors, pension funds and the like, right? So what do you do? What does impact investment mean when this hits? Because essentially, I'll just a minute or two explain sort of the chain. So you've got Grace in Ghana, with some chickens, who gets a loan from a microfinance institution, okay? And she sells her eggs in market. I'm simplifying this, but this is the sort of situation. She's supported by a microfinance institution. That microfinance institution is invested in, say, through a microfinance investment fund, which is invested in by pension funds and charities. That's kind of the chain. Grace is a good businesswoman. She's super smart. She's got a market. She's got a functioning business. It's all good. Pandemic hits. Oh dear, what do you do? Right? Because everything's fine. It just needs to stop for a while. Right? And how do you deal with that as an investor? It's really hard. And what's been amazing, in certainly not all instances, but many instances, is that investor group coming together to solve that problem and figure out moratoriums and figure out holidays for those the people they've lent capital to. And that has been an amazing moment. So I think I was really impressed with what happened there. And I think that was, but I think, I can't really add to David's erudition on this point. I think it's there. It's highlighted everything. We need to be intentional, because at the end of the day, if you're low income, if you're excluded in any way, it hits you harder. So I think it's not too much to add to that. I think on the previous point, a question about government, if I may, I think if you're, there's a couple of things to comment on, is that if you look at the pension world in the UK and elsewhere, I think even if you don't want to be aware of where your capital goes and the impact it has, regulation is coming. It's come, right? So you need to be aware of what's going on here, and you need to be thoughtful about your capital, and you need to explain what you're doing with it from an environmental perspective. And it tends to be the case that where pension funds go, charities follow, if that makes sense. So it's coming. And the other thing, I think there's a couple of things that the government could do, which would be helpful, I think. In terms of CC14 and the various UK regulations and the new guidance that's coming out, I think many people responded it's incredibly unclear, and there are legal challenges coming in and so on. So I think some clarity around that. And I think I talk about it as the plumbing. You know, Sarah spoke about many things which are incredibly helpful, but I think there's a lot of nerdy plumbing that can make life a lot easier for a lot of people. So the general tenor of the advice and the plumbing is basically, whoa, scary, don't do it, gosh, take advice from 1,000 people, spend a fortune, it's difficult, right? That's what the plumbing, there's the regulation, the advice, all of the plumbing that sits alongside impact investment is basically run a mile, okay? And we need to completely change that. So the Dutch, for example, gosh, 20 years ago said, you know what, let's encourage people to make impact investment. How do we do that? Well, we set up the regulatory regime to do that. And we give someone a job to assess it. And then we say, you can, if you issue a prospectus, I think it was around the arts, education, environment, and development world issues, right? You put the prospectus together, you put it in front of a regulator, they say yes or no. We then stick a tax break alongside it, but not one for the rich where they're going to make millions, one for the middle class so they get a bit of a tax break. And off you go. And within 10 years, they had billions invested in impact investment. Nerdy, boring plumbing. Yeah, but signaling, you can do this, it's okay, the government's behind it, there's a bit of a tax break. See what I mean? So I think it's that sort of plumbing which is really helpful.
I totally get what you're saying, that the emphasis needs to be on the front foot rather than somewhat on the back foot. And it's fine if you want to explore it and spend time and effort in doing so, but yeah, those barriers need to be removed. But just swinging back to your earlier observation about investor behavior, Simon, from your perspective, working during the pandemic, Simon, from your perspective, working alongside investors, and David, from the foundation investor perspective, did the pandemic alter investor behavior in the way that Paul described earlier? Has there been the same business as usual criteria applied in terms of process and due diligence and expectations around economic returns?
I'll have a go, and it is early days in terms of how people are reacting, clearly, but I think, starting with the general and then going more towards the specific, there's no doubt, obviously, that the last 15 months have really demonstrated in a way that we've never seen before, the fragility and interdependence of the systems we all rely on. And I think that does bring with it heightened consciousness of the kind of issues that impact investing is seeking to address. I think it's also been very personal for people. We've seen the vulnerability of individuals, and that can be exposed very quickly. We're working with a property fund at the moment that is focused on women fleeing domestic abuse, and that's obviously been highlighted massively in the course of the pandemic, and the issues of a woman who is essentially locked down with an abuser. So I think in those kind of ways, there's definitely a heightened consciousness. It's difficult to say at this moment how that will then translate into long-term behavior by investors, but I think there's a moment in time where there's a wake-up call. But I think more positively, we've also been able to see our ability to collectively respond at a pretty large scale to some of these big challenges. And I think there's hopefully a momentum from that as well to say, we, as Sarah said, we need to bring all the tools to bear on these problems. And that includes large scale institutional investment playing its part. And I'd just cite a very kind of simple and concrete example of the way that that's worked literally in the last 12 months is in homelessness, where the fact that street homeless people needed to be moved off the streets en masse as a response to the pandemic actually was a realization that we can do this. We don't have to have a society where people are sleeping on the streets, but it raised another problem, which is the emergency solution to that was to house people in hotels. Well, that is obviously not a long-term solution. It needs some planning as to where people go from there, and their impact investment has played a role. Even in the last 12 months, it's been possible for impact property funds to provide some of the pathways that people need out of a hotel into a sustainable tenancy rather than back onto the streets. So I think, you know, in the very specific ways, we're beginning to see the way that investment can affect some of these longer term issues. And there's a moment in time here where, you know, the realizations of our collective responsibility can be used to move forward on this.
Yeah, I would just maybe add briefly that I think our concern at the beginning of the pandemic was that there would be a large posture shift to risk off, and that people would go away from these assets. I think you know, it's been really positive that hasn't happened to the extent we feared. I think part of that might just be structural, that if there is a limited partner commitment, if there is kind of these funds that are set up and people have this mandate, they're going to invest. They have to invest, and there's been a lot of capital going into these spaces. So there might be a lag effect on some of those things that we haven't seen yet, to Simon's point about being early in the cycle and seeing how that all plays out. I think what has been disappointing is the rate at which charitable giving has pulled back. That does not have the same type of lag, and that took a, I don't know if risk off is the right terminology, but unfortunate turn at every level, at the individual, at the institutional, and government level. And you know, again, in our experience, there's a great role for charity and direct giving in addition to impact investing. And I think that pullback is going to have some interesting unintended consequences over time.
Yes, indeed. Sarah, do you want to chip in that? No.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I mean, one of the things that's marked the last 12 months is innovation in lots of different spheres. And what we know from history is that crises spur innovation, and we've seen it most obviously with things like the vaccine, the speeded up vaccine production. But there is also a sign that the allied to the growing momentum in people's desire for more sustainable investment products, you've seen some quite interesting financial innovation as well. I mean, I was thinking when Simon was talking, I mean, two investment trusts launched in this country, the BSC, the Big Society Capital, and Schroders Social Impact Investment Trust, and the Home Real Estate Investment Trust, both of which are investing partly in some of the types of impact assets that he's describing for homelessness, addressing homelessness, or people who are subject to domestic abuse. And those are the first two investment trusts that are available to retail investors, so to real people rather than institutional investors. And I think that, you know, and they also show a willingness in the case of the Big Society Capital Schroders product for actors in different parts of that spectrum of capital that I described right at the beginning to work really constructively together, both for commercial gain, but also for positive impact. And I think, you know, there is a greater degree of comfort around these structures of different actors across the spectrum working together than there was, and that will continue. And one of the really promising areas is blended finance, where obviously you use grant capital or concessionary capital of some form as a way of crowding in private sector capital at scale. It's, you know, it's had a challenging history, blended finance, in terms of its ability to crowd in that institutional money. But we're actually seeing some really positive developments, and I think that's a push-pull thing. You know, we see the huge challenges that have to be addressed, so we know we need to mobilise more capital. But there is also really importantly demand increasingly from people, from clients, for these types of products, and that always spurs innovation, which is allied to the pandemic in some ways. It's difficult to say there have been positive things about the last year, but that is one positive, I think.
No, it's a great observation. I think one of the things that Simon touched on, and I think we've seen across the charity and social enterprise sector generally, is that the pandemic exposed the fragility of these organizations and businesses. And will one of the lessons learned, certainly in the relation to philanthropy, but I'm interested, obviously this is about social impact investment, whether there'll be a greater emphasis on improving resilience of these types of businesses, so that they are better placed to survive whatever form the next crisis may take, because there's always going to be another crisis. Simon, do you have a view on that from an investment perspective?
I think it's interesting. I think many fragilities have been exposed, and those aren't just in the charity sector. I think, you know, the fragility of some of our normal business models, normal in the sense of the way things have been done in the past, have been exposed as well. So I actually think social enterprises, which is a broader term for, you know, just than just charity, it's encompassing a wide range of approaches of, you know, delivering what we need as a society, but in a more intentionally impactful way. I actually think that those businesses are showing greater resilience in some cases in the last 12 months, and often will be the innovators for the future in more resilient models that we would like to back through investment. So yes, I think there's been a big emergency response need across the whole economy, including traditional business, social enterprise, and charity, needing you know, immediate interventions to stay viable. But actually, we would be wanting to back going forwards those businesses and enterprises that have an intentional kind of social purpose as more resilient in the long run. That's our thesis.
I'm just conscious of time, so I'm probably going to move on to returning to this question of investor engagement across some sectors, because Paul, it would seem that this area, and you've already talked about CC14, is absolutely custom made for charities, and you've helped a number of organizations partially or fully align investment practice with charitable mission. But for those organizations who may have their toes around the edge of the diving board but are not quite ready to dive in, what practical advice would you give about how they should seek to engage with this? Can you just talk through some bite-sized practical steps, because I know this is a big subject, but I'm just conscious of time.
Gosh, I think people always learn most by talking to peers. So I play and have played a number of different roles. But if you can speak to somebody who has no vested interests other than helping you, who sits in the same position you do somewhere else in another organization, that is the very best conversation you can have, right? So if you're a pension fund trustee talking to another pension fund trustee, or if you're on the board of investment committee of a charity and you can speak to somebody else who has a similar role, who's been through the journey, right? Who understands how challenging it can be, and David has alluded to some of that. You're going to have the very best conversations. So when people come to me and say, Paul, would you help me with this? I often direct them to go and talk to people. So in the UK, that would be talking to people such as UFI Voctec Trust, such as the Friends Provident Foundation, Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, Golden Bottle Trust, you know, those sorts of Panopor, those sorts of organizations who have been through this journey, who know the great stuff that comes out of it and know some of the challenges. And I think that's what as well as obviously engaging with some of the wonderful stories and the wonderful examples and the videos, and it's an emotional journey. Yeah, and that would be my number one piece of advice.
Thank you, Paul. Simon, yeah, go for it.
Jump in to add to what I completely concur with Paul's sense that we also see peer-to-peer learning as the most fruitful approach. And for foundations in the UK, there is something called the Social Impact Investors Group, which has been running for about a decade now, with some of those names that Paul mentioned being quite instrumental along the way, including Paul himself. And that is run now by the Association for Charitable Foundations, the ACF, so you could get involved in that through them. And actually, if you're an institutional investor, there's also now an organisation called Pensions for Purpose, which is performing a similar function within the institutional pensions market of convening those institutional investors who want to learn from each other and also see a range of opportunities that they can kind of look at without being sold to. And that again is forming quite a useful peer-to-peer network, we believe.
And we should make a plug for the Impact Investing Institute, who is absolutely mission aligned to bring people together, to share best practice. Wonderful work there. You know, there's a lot of resources out there. So I think there are many things you can say, but there are many organizations you go to. Impact Investing Institute is a classic example of that, for best practice and learning from peers and so on. But the number one thing you can do is talk to people who've been there and done it.
Can I quickly come in and thank you for the shout out, Paul? All I was going to say that on that specific pensions for purpose tip that Simon was usefully sharing, our pensions programme is actually run in tandem with pensions for purpose, and there are a number of resources. Just mention two very quickly. One is a paper we've developed with our pro bono legal panel on fiduciary duty and its compatibility with impact investment, because this is one of the big hurdles that trustees face. They believe wrongly that their fiduciary duty is not compatible with impact investing. And the other thing is a set of principles for impact investing, which are designed to help guide the conversation initially and then taking you along the journey. And that we have a sort of adopters forum, where we peer precisely for that peer-to-peer learning and support that is, as Paul and Simon have said, is so important. And just finally, building an evidence base around impact investments, because as everyone's saying, you can tell people, but what's most important is to show people what other people have done. And what's fantastic is that there is now a growing body of research and evidence to show that the types of impact and return that you can consider across a whole set of different asset classes and geographies.
No, I think that's helpful. And if anyone hasn't seen it, there's a great short video on your website, Sarah, about debunking certain myths around fiduciary duties for pension trustees, which is well worth a watch. It's very short.
It's a racy one, I can assure you.
Yeah. I wouldn't describe it as racy necessarily. It's pensions after all, but it's if I could just turn, picking up on Paul's earlier observations about some of the perceived barriers to participation, and we've talked about sort of peer-to-peer discussions, but how can charities help other charities? So Simon, you have to line up and coordinate charity investors in relation to a fund launch, and my perception, having been involved from the charity perspective of engaging in that, is that some of the charities, we all sort of operate in silos in considering the investment opportunity. Is there a way of sort of short-circuiting some of that so there's sort of better collaboration? I mean, I know the answer is going to be yes, but if you could sort of talk through what you think some of the practical things that some of lead charities, almost perhaps like the Gates Foundation, can do to help others follow in their wake.
Sure. I think that there are some practical things, and we try to coordinate this as an investment manager when we have multiple investors coming into these funds, to try to see if they can particularly share due diligence and legal advice, because often there's no point in them replicating that across a kind of cohort of investors. So I think that's the simple thing that they can either self-organize around or we can often assist in. And then, yeah, I think the forums that I mentioned, particularly the Social Impact Investors Group, I think is another natural place for those organisations to kind of get to know each other and coalesce around a sense that they want to invest in a group into a particular opportunity rather than look at it completely individually. And I think that that can help on the point that David had made at the very outset, which is the wonderful diversity of different issues that the foundations are all trying to address, but actually through dialogue with each other kind of realize that there are things out there that don't perfectly fit all of their requirements, but actually collectively when they invest into them together, they can actually make a significant difference in an area that they care about, be that, as I say, the issue of domestic abuse or homelessness or housing for learning disability. These do draw different constituent investors together around those issues.
Thank you for that. Oh, Paul, I will come to you, but we're going to run out of time. And I just want to ask probably David a final question, because I think we got I would like to end on a really good question that someone's raised who's watching. But David, we've talked a lot about the UK, but clearly Gates Foundation has a global reach. Could you just give us a sense of the international perspective in terms of impact investment in developing countries, and what's happening there? What the impact of the FCDO cuts have been in terms of pulling back, and just sort of give us a very short and sweet overview in the next 3 minutes, if you might.
Yeah, happy to. Maybe before I do that, just another vote for reaching out to your peer organizations and learning from them. One of the organizations that really helped us along our journey over the past 10 years is Wellcome Trust, who've been active in program-related investments for many years. Actually, I was seconded there for a few weeks, just follow them around like a happy puppy and learn as much as I could, which was great early on as we did that. And to the extent the foundation can be helpful, I just in the chat put a link to some white papers and articles we did in partnership with the Stanford Social Innovation Review about our program and kind of how we're set up. Not saying we do everything right, but to the extent that can be something useful for other organizations, please take a look at that. Regarding, kind of the broader investment case for impact investing in emerging markets, I think there's kind of two pieces to that. I'm incredibly bullish on investments in emerging markets broadly. I mean, ignoring the impact case, I think these markets are where a lot of the growth is going to happen going forward and are going to benefit from technology advancements more than any other market. We've seen that with innovations starting with mobile phones, leapfrogging landlines. Mobile payments has done the same thing versus traditional bank infrastructure. And we're likely to see it in healthcare and other areas where you're able to, through technology and really lowering the marginal cost. If you get the marginal cost down to almost nothing, then you can reach new customers, new opportunities for growth in a way that hasn't been done before. And that's a fantastic investment thesis broadly. On impact investing, unfortunately, I think it's more mixed. It really depends what are your impact goals, because a lot of these countries, well, I think they have great investment fundamentals and some segments of society will do quite well. They also have many challenges around exposure to environmental change, for example, climate change. They have a lot of challenges around governance, rule of law, some of the challenges we've seen with misinformation and social media fomenting, I would say, sometimes less than helpful discussions within populations and creating pushback against democracy or broad government. That again hits many of these markets in ways that is even more exacerbated than it does in traditional developed markets that have stronger institutions. And so I think impact investing in these markets could be fantastic. It also could be incredibly high risk. And I think that the feedback I would give is kind of going back to the beginning of the call is really making your impact investments in areas that you know well, that are aligned with the knowledge base and goals of your organization closely, and or with organizations that you trust in order to get that scale and really support them. And doing that in emerging markets, if that is one of the focus areas, is something that would be incredibly impactful and perhaps a really good investment case as well.
You're
Sorry.
mute.
Yeah, sorry, my button wasn't working. Just to end, so thank you all, and I know that you've had to canter through some areas where you would love to have explored, with a great deal more depth and being much more expansive, and you've been incredibly good in just getting to the highlights, and I thank you for that, because it's not easy to condense this subject. But we've had a good question in, and I think it's a good one to end on. If everyone could give a sort of short 60 seconds on a great investment which they've been involved in, which is in a sense ticked all the boxes, and one that they're most proud of being involved in, as a quick highlight and a practical example for everyone. I think that would be a good one to end on. So I will open it to the floor. So who might want to go first?
I'm happy to go first if you'd like me to.
Yes, Sarah, we'll start with you. Thank you, Sarah.
We're not an investor, so this is not, and we don't get involved in direct investments. We're a neutral convening body to sort of grow the market. and make it more effective, just to make that clear. But we're also building up this range of case studies, as I've shared, and there are lots of pioneers in this field. I mean, some of them in this room as well. But Bridges Fund Management has done a lot of really exciting investments that deliver a combination of social and environmental impact, which is something that we feel is very important to think of as interlinked. And one of the ones I liked is it's a property investment in Cannock, which is just off the M6 toll road in Staffordshire. And it's where there was a former open cast coal mine, which had been disused for half a century. It was, there've now been new industrial warehouses built on the site, and they were built with the support of the local community. They will generate jobs for 400, it's expected 450 local jobs. They're also, the buildings are highly energy efficient, and they've got this is an institutional investor product with an extremely high internal rate of return. So it's a great example, I think.
All right, I'll have a crack. So I'm not going to plug resonances stuff, but pretty much anything they've come up with over the years, I've been really interested in. I think one which I particularly love is the story of Autocon, which I don't know if anyone's familiar with, but essentially there's a German IT consultant who had a high functioning autistic son who, and that was a problem for him. And he found out that the unemployment rate of people in Germany on the spectrum was like off the scale. And even if they were employed, they tended to be in very sort of low end, low capability sort of jobs. And yet their IQs are very high. So it was a very, very bad situation. It's costing the state an absolute fortune as well. And what he knew as an IT consultant, a software developer, was that actually a very important part of software development or IT consultancy was actually testing. At the end of anyone's developed software, they'll know that's a really, and it's a specific set of skills, and you have to follow a specific set of rules. And actually, it fits really, really well with people who are on the spectrum. That makes sense. And so he developed a consultancy specifically focused on people on the spectrum, giving them jobs they love doing, which are very highly paid and really appreciated by the client, right? Because getting great testing, now there's all sorts of challenges associated with that, okay? And it's really hard to do well. But that's a business which it always makes my heart sing when I think about that story. And he's made a fortune. So it's like
the happy byproduct. Yeah, thank you. Simon, do you want to go next? I suspect you might be plugging Resonance, and I would welcome you to do so.
I have to speak from my own experience, I'm afraid, yes. And but I think, you know, I would say a great example recently for us has been the Women in Safe Homes Fund that we launched just before Christmas, which is really an extension of what we've been doing with homelessness property funds. But the thing that's really interesting for me about it was the realization that we needed to take a gender lens approach through that initiative and ring fence it to recognise that the needs of women in circumstances of homelessness, fleeing domestic abuse, coming out of prison, are different from men. And the women's sector organisations around the UK that provide those pathways for women have different needs from some of the other larger housing associations that are providing more general needs social housing. So it was really a sharpening of the focus, the impact focus around that need, and responding to that through a fund that can deliver a gender lens approach to that impact aspect. And we did it in partnership as well. We're partnering with Patron Capital, who are a mainstream property manager, as a way of saying that, you know, this is about mainstreaming this as well. And, you know, we think we can do it through a joint venture. So that was an interesting recent example from us.
And David, the final word is yours.
I appreciate everyone's patience and fantastic stories of impact and hope that's out there. I think that the one that I really like is our investment in a mobile payments company called Bcash, based in Bangladesh. First worked with the company, and I went down to visit in 2014. And at that point, I, you know, as a non-Bangladeshi, was able to sign up for a mobile payment plan with Bcash. and transfer money across town, go and buy something with the money and do an ATM withdrawal. And I did all of that from signing up for the mobile payment plan and even the mobile service to finally pulling from the ATM within an hour. Versus in the US, at the time, you couldn't transfer between two accounts you owned at different banks in less than a day. And so seeing the potential of this technology and the great entrepreneurs who were behind it, and also the traction that M-Pesa and others had in that space, we invested in 2014. And fast forward to the pandemic, at that point, more than half of the adults in Bangladesh had a Bcash account. And in response to the pandemic, the government was able to make emergency payments to 970,000 families within a week of the pandemic and lockdown versus developed governments all over the world struggling to get checks out to their constituents months later. And so being able to see what this technology can do, both to change the paradigm of what's possible and to impact a lot of lives has been pretty incredible.
Well, I think all of those examples, not only great notes to end on, but a fantastic illustration of how diverse and creative this space is and how the impact dimension really can change the world. I think a cat has entered Sarah's screen, which must mean that it's time to draw a veil over this. So I would just end. We're a little bit over, but thank you so much for your participation. If I had a sound effect, I'd press it now and you would hear the applause coming from people listening to thank you for your involvement. So thank you again, and hopefully we'll do this again in the not too distant future. So thank you all for participating, and thank you everyone for joining us today.